I have till midnight to remarry or lose everything." That's what the desperate widow told the giant cowboy, right there in the middle of Willow Creek's main street. By sundown, her ranch would be gone. The bank had the papers, the railroad had the muscle, and her late husband's brother? He had the grin of a vulture circling what's already dead. But the widow wasn't ready to lay down and lose her land. Not when a man like him, a man built like a mountain and twice as stubborn, stepped forward with a vow. Problem is, the railroad didn't plan on her finding a husband, and they sure didn't plan on her finding a secret hidden beneath that ranch, the kind of secret men are willing to kill for. Before the church bell tolls midnight, they'll have to outrun hired guns, outwit the law, and outlast the lies. But when marriage is the only weapon left, can two strangers forge a bond strong enough to save a valley? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. Eleanor Voss felt the weight of every eye in Willow Creek upon her as she stood rigid before the bank's foreclosure agent. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street, painting the weathered buildings in shades of amber and gold. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her chin high, refusing to show weakness before the growing crowd of onlookers. "As per the terms of your late husband's trust," the foreclosure agent, Mr. Simmons, announced with barely concealed satisfaction, "you must remarry by midnight this very night, or the ranch and its water rights will be forfeit." He adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, the glass catching the setting sun's glare. "I believe the railroad has expressed considerable interest in those water rights." Jamie's small hand tightened around Eleanor's, and she could feel him trembling. Her nephew had already lost so much. His parents, his home, and now this threat to the only stability he had left. Eleanor swallowed hard, tasting dust and bitterness. The townsfolk's whispers rose like rustling leaves in an autumn wind. Eleanor caught fragments of their gossip. Poor widow. Such a shame. Railroad's been eyeing that land for months. Mr. Simmons cleared his throat, clearly enjoying his moment of power. "And there's one more detail you should be aware of, Mrs. Voss. Your late husband's brother has filed a claim to seize the ranch once the deadline passes at midnight." Eleanor's knees weakened, but she locked them straight. Her brother-in-law had always resented that Thomas had inherited the ranch. Now he would use this trust clause to take everything she and Jamie had left. The crowd's murmuring grew louder, more concerned. These were her neighbors, people who had known her family for years, but none stepped forward. None except Dash. "I'll marry you." The deep, quiet voice cut through the whispers like a knife through butter. The crowd parted, revealing Matthew Holt, the town's blacksmith. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, dark eyes steady as he looked at Eleanor. Though his clothes were plain and his hands bore the marks of honest work, he carried himself with a dignity that made others step back. Eleanor's pride rose up like a wall. "Mr. Holt, I don't need—" "You need your land," he said simply, not moving from his spot. "You need your home for Jamie, and I reckon I need a wife who knows her own mind." The sincerity in his voice made her pause. She had seen Matthew Holt almost daily for years, bringing horses to be shod or tools to be mended. He had always been fair in his dealings, quiet in his manner. A man who listened more than he spoke. But marriage? Her hands trembled at her sides. The sun continued its relentless descent, now barely visible above the saloon's roof. Each passing minute was another grain of sand in a rapidly emptying hourglass. Jamie tugged at her sleeve. "Aunt Eleanor," he whispered, his young voice cracking. "I don't want to leave the ranch. Please." She looked down into his pleading eyes, seeing the ghost of his father, her beloved brother, in his features. The ranch wasn't just land and water rights. It was Jamie's inheritance, his future. It was the only home he had left. The crowd waited, breath held, as Eleanor turned back to Matthew. His expression remained steady, patient. No triumph, no calculation, just a simple offer of help when it was most needed. Pride warred with desperation in her chest. The sun's last rays painted the sky in fierce oranges and reds, a reminder that time was running out. She thought of the ranch, the carefully maintained irrigation ditches, the cattle her father had bred for decades, the small cemetery where her parents rested. All of it would be lost if she let her pride win this battle. Eleanor squared her shoulders and met Matthew's gaze. "I have till midnight to remarry or lose everything." She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders. "If you'll have me, sir, I'll be your wife." The words hung in the air like a church bell's toll. Matthew nodded once, solemn and respectful, while the crowd erupted in surprised murmurs and exclamations. Mr. Simmons's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of frustrated calculation. Jamie's grip on Eleanor's hand loosened slightly, hope replacing fear in his young face. As she stood there in the fading light, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, not just resignation, but perhaps the first fragile seed of hope. Matthew Holt was a good man, everyone said so. Maybe, just maybe, this desperate solution could become something more than mere survival. The sun disappeared completely behind the saloon, leaving them all in the purpled shadows of dusk. The race against midnight had begun. Dusk painted the western sky in deep purples as Eleanor hurried toward the livery stable, her boots kicking up dust with each determined stride. Matthew walked beside her, his longer legs matching her urgent pace, while Jamie trotted to keep up. The boy's face was flushed with equal parts excitement and worry. "The wagon's ready," Matthew said, his voice low and steady. "I kept it prepared, just in case of emergency calls to outlying homesteads." He gestured to a sturdy farm wagon, its wooden sides weathered but solid. Eleanor nodded, grateful for his foresight. "We'll need to reach Preacher Amos before midnight." Her voice caught slightly. "The justice of the peace being away on circuit leaves us no choice but the mission station." Sarah Miller, Eleanor's closest neighbor, came hurrying across the street, her grey shawl fluttering in the evening breeze. "Eleanor!" she called out in a harsh whisper. "The railroad men were in the telegraph office not 10 minutes ago. They know about the trust clause, and they won't let you make it to the preacher easy." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Of course the railroad wouldn't play fair. They never had. She watched as Matthew moved to the horses with quiet efficiency, his hands gentle, but quick as he fitted the harnesses. The heavy leather straps creaked as Matthew worked, checking each buckle with practiced care. His movements were deliberate, unhurried despite the urgency of their situation. There was something reassuring about his methodical approach that made Eleanor's racing heart slow just a fraction. "Much obliged for the warning, Sarah," Eleanor said, turning to her friend. "We'll be careful." Jamie appeared from the storage shed, struggling with a large basket. "I packed bread and cheese," he announced proudly, "and some of those apples we were saving." His small face was serious with responsibility. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. In the chaos of the moment, she hadn't even thought about provisions. "That's good thinking, Jamie," she said softly, resting her hand on his shoulder. The boy had already lost so much. She couldn't let him lose his home too. Matthew finished with the team and turned to help Jamie secure the basket in the wagon. "The horses are fresh," he said. "They'll make good time on the mission road." His calm confidence eased some of the tension from Eleanor's shoulders, though she couldn't quite shake the strangeness of the situation. Just hours ago, this man had been simply the town blacksmith. Now he was to be her husband. The thought made her stomach twist. She climbed onto the wagon seat, arranging her skirts as Matthew helped Jamie up between them. The wooden planks were smooth from years of use, worn to a soft grey that matched the deepening evening sky. "There's movement in the alleys," Sarah whispered urgently, pointing toward the shadows between buildings. "Railroad men. I'd stake my life on it." Eleanor followed her gesture and caught glimpses of dark figures slipping between the buildings. Her spine stiffened. "They'll try to delay us until midnight." Matthew settled onto the seat beside Jamie, gathering the reins in his capable hands. "They'll try," he agreed quietly. "But they don't know these back roads like we do." He clicked softly to the horses, and the wagon rolled forward. The full moon was just rising as they approached the wooden bridge that marked the edge of Willow Creek. Its pale light silvered the weathered planks and cast long shadows across the creek bed below. The wagon wheels rumbled across the timbers, each thud marking another step away from everything familiar. Eleanor glanced back at the town she'd called home her entire life. In the gathering darkness, lanterns were being lit in windows, creating warm pools of light that seemed to mock their hasty departure. The railroad men's shadows had multiplied, moving with purpose now, no longer trying to hide their presence. Jamie pressed closer to Eleanor's side. "Will they catch us, Aunt Eleanor?" Before she could answer, Matthew's steady voice cut through the darkness. "No, son. We've got good horses, a sound wagon, and the Lord's own moonlight to guide us." He handled the reins with subtle expertise, keeping the team at a pace that would cover ground without wearing them out. "Besides, your aunt's not the type to give up easy. Are you Mrs. Voss?" Eleanor met his eyes briefly, surprised by the glimmer of understanding she saw there. "No, Mr. Holt," she replied. "I reckon I'm not." The wagon continued across the bridge, its creaking a counterpoint to the gentle splash of water below. As they reached the far side, Eleanor felt the first real stirring of hope. They had a chance, slim as it might be, to outrace both the railroad men and the midnight deadline. The moon climbed higher, casting their shadows long across the dusty road ahead, while behind them, Willow Creek grew smaller with each turn of the wheels. The wagon wheels splashed through shallow puddles as they followed the winding creek road. Eleanor kept her eyes on the path ahead, illuminated by their swaying lantern. The steady clip-clop of hooves and creak of leather harnesses had become almost soothing in the last hour of travel. Jamie had dozed off against her shoulder, his small frame warm despite the evening chill. Matthew drove with careful attention, his broad shoulders blocking some of the cool breeze. The moon cast everything in silver light, making the creek's surface glitter like scattered coins. As they approached the narrow crossing, Eleanor spotted two mounted figures blocking the path. Her heart quickened. The railroad men Sarah had warned them about had gotten ahead somehow. Matthew drew the wagon to a gentle stop, careful not to wake Jamie. The horses nickered softly, steam rising from their flanks in the cool air. "Evening, folks," called one of the riders, his voice carrying false concern. "Afraid there's been a washout ahead. Road's closed until morning." His partner shifted in his saddle, hand resting too casually near his holster. Eleanor felt Matthew stiffen beside her. Without a word, he passed her the reins and stepped down from the wagon. His boots hit the ground with a solid thud that seemed to echo in the quiet night. The mounted men suddenly looked less sure of themselves as Matthew's full height became apparent. He stood at least a head taller than their horses, his blacksmith's frame casting a long shadow in the moonlight. "Funny," Matthew said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly. "I drove this road yesterday. No sign of trouble then." He walked forward with unhurried steps, each movement deliberate and controlled. The second rider's horse danced nervously, picking up on its master's tension. "Things change quick in spring weather," he said, but his voice wavered. Matthew reached the crude barrier they'd assembled, a few branches dragged across the path. Without breaking eye contact with the riders, he began methodically moving the branches aside, his powerful hands making light work of the task. The first rider's hand dropped to his pistol. "Now see here." Matthew straightened to his full height, still holding a heavy branch. His voice remained calm, but Eleanor heard steel beneath the quiet words. "You really want to draw on an unarmed man in front of a child?" The moonlight caught the riders' faces as they glanced at the wagon where Jamie now sat wide awake, watching with wide eyes. The man's hand moved away from his gun. Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth in her chest, watching Matthew stand his ground without raising his voice or making threats. There was something deeply reassuring about his quiet strength, his refusal to be bullied. The railroad won't take kindly to interference, the first rider warned, but he was already turning his horse aside. Neither will the law, Matthew replied evenly, tossing the last branch into the underbrush. Good evening, gentlemen. The riders withdrew into the shadows, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft ground. Matthew returned to the wagon, climbing up beside them as if nothing unusual had happened. Eleanor handed back the reins, acutely aware of his solid presence beside her. Thank you, she said softly. Matthew clicked to the horses, urging them forward. No need for thanks. Some men only understand strength, but that doesn't mean you have to speak their language. They crossed the creek slowly, water splashing against the wagon wheels. Eleanor was lost in thought, still processing Matthew's handling of the situation, when Jamie suddenly grabbed her arm. Aunt Eleanor, he whispered urgently. Look there, in the trees. Eleanor followed his pointing finger to a cluster of old cottonwoods. For just a moment, she caught sight of a familiar figure watching them from the shadows. Someone she knew, though she couldn't quite make out their features in the darkness. Before she could get a better look, they melted away into the night. Jamie pressed closer to her side. Did you see them? Who was that? I'm not sure, Eleanor replied, though a nagging feeling told her she did know. She glanced at Matthew, but he was focused on guiding the horses up the muddy bank. The wagon crested the slope, wheels finding firmer ground. Behind them, the creek crossing lay quiet in the moonlight, no sign remaining of their confrontation except the scattered branches Matthew had cleared. Eleanor found herself studying his profile as he drove, seeing him with new eyes. This man who had offered to marry her, a virtual stranger just hours ago, had stood against armed men without violence or bluster, protecting them through sheer force of character. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. She had spent so long standing alone, it felt strange to have someone else fight her battles, even in this quiet way. Yet she couldn't deny the surge of security she'd felt watching him face down the railroad men. Jamie yawned and leaned against her again, his eyes growing heavy. I'm glad Mr. Holt is with us, he murmured sleepily. Eleanor smoothed his hair, surprised to realize she agreed. The night was far from over, but somehow Matthew's steady presence made their desperate journey feel less impossible. A twig snapped in the darkness, and Eleanor's hand tightened on Jamie's shoulder. The shadowy figure emerged from behind the cottonwoods, moonlight revealing the familiar face of Nakai, a young Apache boy Jamie often played with near the creek. Nakai! Jamie called out softly, his face brightening with recognition. Matthew pulled the wagon to a gentle stop as Nakai approached, his moccasins silent on the damp earth. The boy's dark eyes were serious, his usual smile replaced by worry. You must take different path, Nakai said, his English clear but urgent. Railroad men wait ahead at Devil's Fork. They pay locals with silver to stop you reaching the mission. Eleanor leaned forward. How do you know this? I listen. They not see Apache boy in shadows? Nakai's gaze met Eleanor's directly. But there is more you must know, Miss Eleanor. The spring on your land. It is sacred ground. The night seemed to grow still around them. Even the horses stood quiet, as if sensing the weight of his words. Sacred ground? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nakai nodded solemnly. My people's ancestors sleep there. Many generations. The waters flow from their resting place. He gestured toward the stars. My grandmother told me stories of healing ceremonies held there before... His voice trailed off, heavy with unspoken history. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the wagon seat. Her father had never mentioned this, though she remembered how he'd insisted on protecting certain areas of the ranch from development. Now his actions took on new meaning. If railroad men take the land, Nakai continued, they will dig. They will build. The sacred places will be... He struggled for the word. Desecrated. Matthew finished quietly, understanding in his deep voice. Jamie looked between the adults, his young face troubled. We can't let them do that, Aunt Eleanor. We just can't. Matthew studied Nakai thoughtfully. You know these lands well? The boy straightened proudly. Every path, every hollow. My people walked here for many seasons before others came. Then we could use your help, Matthew said. There must be ways to reach the mission that the railroad men don't know about. Nakai's eyes lit up. Yes, old trails through the hills. Hard for wagon, but possible, with care. I can show you? Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. All this time she'd thought she was just fighting for her home, for Jamie's future. But now she understood she was guardian of something far more precious. Her father must have known, must have chosen to protect these sacred grounds in his own quiet way. Please, she said to Nakai, her voice thick with emotion, help us reach the mission. This land deserves better than to be torn up for railroad profits. Nakai climbed onto the wagon with the fluid grace of youth, settling beside Jamie, who immediately made room for his friend. The two boys exchanged small smiles, their friendship bridging worlds wider than the creek they'd just crossed. Take left path ahead, Nakai directed, pointing toward a barely visible trail leading into the scrubland. Stay close to ridge. Moon will light the way. As Matthew guided the horses onto the new trail, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. The desperate race to save her ranch had become something larger, something that touched lives beyond her own. She glanced at Matthew, saw the same understanding in his steady gaze. We'll make it, he said softly, reading her thoughts. Some things are worth fighting for. Eleanor nodded, watching as Nakai pointed out landmarks to Jamie in hushed tones. The wagon creaked forward under the star-filled sky, carrying its passengers toward a destiny that had grown both heavier and more meaningful with each passing mile. The sacred springs would not fall to the railroad's greed. Not tonight. Not while she had breath in her body and good people willing to stand beside her. The narrow ravine walls rose like shadowy sentinels on either side of their small party. Nakai led them forward, his steps sure despite the darkness. The wagon wheels caught on loose rocks, forcing them to move at a crawl. Matthew walked beside the horses, guiding them with gentle words when they snorted nervously at the close quarters. Eleanor stepped carefully over a jutting rock, her boots scraping against stone. Jamie stayed close to Nakai, the two boys communicating in whispers and gestures. The moon cast strange shadows through the sparse trees above, making the ravine feel like another world entirely. Careful here, Matthew said softly, offering his hand as Eleanor navigated a particularly treacherous stretch. His palm was warm and calloused, steady as the mountains themselves. Thank you, she murmured, allowing herself to accept his help. When she would have pulled away, he kept hold for just a moment longer. Your husband, Matthew said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the creak of wagon wheels. He didn't make things easy for you, did he? Eleanor stiffened, then forced herself to relax. In the darkness, with only Matthew's solid presence beside her, the truth slipped out easier than she expected. No, she admitted. He was more in love with gambling than with me, left me with nothing but debts and broken promises. Matthew was quiet for several steps. I'm sorry, he said finally. You deserved better. And you? Eleanor found herself asking. What ghosts chase you, Matthew Holt? He drew a deep breath, releasing it slowly. Saw too much during the war. Battles where both sides lost everything that mattered. Watched good men die for causes that weren't worth their blood. His voice grew distant. Came west hoping to find something worth building instead of destroying. Eleanor studied his profile in the moonlight. And have you? Found something worth building? Before he could answer, Nakai raised his hand in warning. Everyone froze. The boy pointed ahead, where the ravine widened slightly. Eleanor squinted into the darkness. A shadow detached itself from the rock face. Moonlight glinted off the barrel of a shotgun. "That's far enough," a gruff voice called out. "Railroad sends its regards. Turn back now. Nobody needs to get hurt." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. She felt Jamie press close against her side, trembling slightly. Nakai melted back into the shadows, silent as a ghost. Matthew stepped forward, his massive frame blocking Eleanor and Jamie from the gunman's direct line of sight. He carried no weapon. They'd left in such a hurry there hadn't been time. But his voice was steady, almost conversational. "Evening, friend," he said. "Mighty dangerous, pointing that shotgun around in the dark. Might hit something you don't mean to." "Ain't your friend," the man growled. "And I mean to hit exactly what I'm aiming at if you don't turn that wagon around." Matthew took another step forward. "Way I see it, you've got one shot, maybe two if it's a double barrel, but there's 4 of us, and that ravine echo is going to bring every lawman within 10 miles running once you fire." He paused, letting that sink in. "Besides," he continued, "you really want to explain to a judge how you happened to be out here in the middle of the night, threatening innocent folks with a shotgun?" Eleanor watched Matthew's back, saw the tension in his shoulders despite his calm words. He turned his head slightly, caught her eye. In that brief look, she read his message clearly. "Trust me." And she did. Heaven help her, but she trusted this quiet giant of a man who'd stepped forward to help her when everyone else stepped back. The gunman shifted his weight, uncertainty creeping into his stance. "Got paid good money to stop you reaching that mission." "Keep it," Matthew said. "Tell them you tried. Tell them we never came this way at all." He gestured at the ravine walls. "Lots of paths through these hills. Who's to say which one we took?" Silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft nickering of the horses. Eleanor held her breath, one hand on Jamie's shoulder, the other clenched in her skirts. Finally, the shotgun lowered. "Reckon you might be right about that echo," the man muttered. "And about them other paths." He backed away, melting into the shadows he'd emerged from. "Just remember, I ain't the only one they paid to stop you." They waited until his footsteps faded completely before anyone moved. Nakai reappeared as silently as he'd vanished, nodding once to indicate the way ahead was clear. Eleanor touched Matthew's arm as he turned back to the wagon. "Thank you," she whispered. He covered her hand with his own, and in that brief touch she felt the tremor he'd hidden so well during the confrontation. "Still think I'm worth taking a chance on?" he asked softly. She squeezed his arm gently. "More with every mile." They started forward again, more cautious than before, but something had changed between them, forged in the sharing of old wounds and the trust of that silent moment. Eleanor felt it in the way Matthew stayed closer to her side, in how their hands found each other's when the path grew treacherous. The ravine walls continued their silent watch as the small party pressed onward, time slipping away like water through their fingers, the mission still hours ahead. The gunman's finger tightened on the trigger, moonlight catching the metal of the shotgun barrel. Matthew took another deliberate step forward, his voice carrying clearly through the ravine. "Might interest you to know," he said conversationally, "that 3 federal marshals rode into Willow Creek this afternoon. Something about investigating railroad interference with legal property transfers." He kept his hands visible, stance relaxed, despite the weapon aimed at his chest. "They'll be mighty curious about any gunshots echoing through these hills tonight." Eleanor watched Matthew's broad shoulders, wondering at his calm demeanor. The horses shifted restlessly, harness leather creaking in the tense silence. "You're bluffing," the gunman said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Matthew's quiet confidence filled the narrow space between the ravine walls. "Way I hear it, Judge Harrison himself requested their presence. Seems he's taken a particular interest in certain railroad activities lately." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Now, I reckon explaining to a federal judge why you're out here threatening folks with that shotgun might prove uncomfortable." Jamie pressed closer to Eleanor's side, his small hand finding hers in the darkness. She squeezed it reassuringly, heart pounding as she watched the scene unfold. The gunman's stance wavered. Could just shoot you anyway. Ain't nobody'd find you in these hills. 3 shots, Matthew said simply. That's what it would take to silence all of us. Even with that double barrel, you'd never manage it before one of us got away. Then you'd have federal marshals combing every inch of this territory. He shook his head slowly. All that trouble just to stop a widow from keeping her rightful property? Sweat gleamed on the gunman's face despite the cool night air. His eyes darted between Matthew's imposing figure and the shadows where Nakai had disappeared. The boy had melted into the darkness so completely even Eleanor couldn't spot him now. Railroad's paying good money, the man muttered, but his shotgun barrel had started to drift downward. Keep it, Matthew suggested. Tell them we never came this way at all. Plenty of other paths through these hills, aren't there? The gunman's resolve crumbled visibly. He lowered the shotgun completely, backing away into the shadows. Just remember, you ain't the only ones they paid to stop you. They waited in silence until his footsteps faded completely. Nakai materialized beside the wagon, nodding once to indicate the path ahead was clear. Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Matthew turned back to them, and now she could see the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed the strain of the confrontation. He'd risked his life for her cause, without raising a fist or drawing a weapon. Matthew, she said softly, stepping forward to touch his arm. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever witnessed. A slight smile touched his lips. Sometimes they're the same thing, Mrs. Voss. Eleanor, she corrected him gently. I reckon if we're to be married by midnight, you might as well use my given name. His eyes met hers in the moonlight, something warm and steady in their depths. Eleanor, he agreed quietly. They resumed their journey, Matthew leading the horses while Eleanor walked beside him. Jamie and Nakai scouted ahead, the boys' whispered conversations barely audible over the wagon wheels. Eleanor glanced at the moon's position, anxiety tightening her chest. It must be nearly 11 o'clock, she said. The mission's still an hour away, if we're lucky. We'll make it, Matthew assured her, though she could hear the concern beneath his confident tone. Nakai knows these paths better than any railroad man. He'll see us through. She studied his profile as they walked, this quiet giant who'd stepped forward when everyone else had stepped back. Why did you offer to marry me? She asked suddenly. Back in town, when the bank agent made that announcement, you could have stayed silent like all the rest. Matthew was quiet for several steps, considering his answer. Because it wasn't right, he said finally. What they're trying to do to you, to your land, it isn't right. Sometimes a man has to stand up against wrong, even if standing up means binding his life to a stranger's. And now? Eleanor asked softly. Do you regret that decision? He turned to look at her then, his eyes reflecting the starlight above. No, he said simply. I don't reckon I do. The wagon creaked onward through the night, each turn of the wheels bringing them closer to their destination, or to ruin if they couldn't reach it in time. But Eleanor felt stronger now, more certain of her path. Matthew's quiet courage had shown her that sometimes the greatest strength lay not in fighting, but in standing firm for what was right. Time slipped away like water through their fingers as they pressed forward, the mission still an hour distant. But Eleanor found herself drawing comfort from Matthew's steady presence beside her, from the quiet trust that had begun to grow between them in these desperate hours. The wagon lurched sharply, wheels catching on unseen rocks in the darkness. Eleanor gripped the seat as they navigated the treacherous terrain, each bump and dip making the old wood groan in protest. Above them, stars pierced the velvet sky, offering just enough light to make out the path's vague outline. Matthew walked beside the horses, guiding them with gentle words and a steady hand on their bridles. Nakai moved like a shadow ahead, finding the safest route through the rocky ground, while Jamie kept watch from the wagon's rear. A sickening crack split the night air, The wagon pitched violently to one side. Eleanor's stomach lurched as the whole vehicle listed, threatening to topple. Matthew's powerful arms steadied the horses before they could bolt. "The axle's gone," Eleanor said, her voice hollow as she climbed down to inspect the damage. In the dim starlight, she could see where the wooden beam had snapped clean through. Her throat tightened. "It's over. We'll never make it now." But Matthew was already moving, his broad shoulders bunching as he braced himself against the wagon's side. "Jamie, Nakai, find some flat stones, strong ones." His voice remained calm, though strain showed in his neck as he lifted the wagon's weight. The boys scrambled to comply, searching the ground with quick, sure movements. Eleanor watched in amazement as Matthew held the heavy wagon steady, muscles trembling with effort, but never giving way. "Here!" Jamie called, returning with Nakai. Both boys carried rocks of various sizes. "Good lads," Matthew grunted. "Now wedge them in tight where I show you. We'll splint this axle proper." Eleanor found herself moving without conscious thought, helping the boys position stones while Matthew directed them. Sweat gleamed on his forehead, despite the cool night air, but he never complained about the weight. "Another stone there," he instructed. "Eleanor, if you could pass me that length of rope from the supplies." She worked alongside him, their hands brushing as they secured the makeshift repair. There was something different in the way he spoke to her now, not as a damsel to be rescued, but as a capable partner in their shared challenge. "Hold it steady," Matthew said, and she braced the axle while he knotted the rope. His movements were sure and practiced, making the most of their limited tools and time. Jamie and Nakai worked in seamless tandem, the two boys anticipating each other's needs without words. When Nakai needed a smaller stone, Jamie was already searching. When Jamie struggled with a knot, Nakai's clever fingers helped without being asked. Eleanor felt something shift inside her as she watched them all work together. This wasn't just a desperate race against time anymore. These people, this quiet giant of a man, these two brave boys, they had become something more than mere traveling companions. "There," Matthew said finally, stepping back to inspect their work. "It won't hold forever, but it should get us to the mission." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes finding hers in the starlight. "If you're willing to trust it." "I trust you," she replied softly, surprising herself with how much she meant it. They resumed their journey, moving more carefully now, but still with urgent purpose. The repaired axle creaked ominously but held firm, a testament to their combined efforts. Eleanor found herself studying Matthew's profile as he led the horses. She'd been so wrong about him at first, seeing his offer of marriage as an attempt to save her. But here in the darkness, working side by side, she understood the truth. He wasn't trying to be her savior. He was offering to be her partner, her equal in facing whatever challenges lay ahead. The wagon crested a small rise, and suddenly there it was, a dark shape against the star-strewn sky. The mission's steeple rose from the plains like a finger pointing heavenward, its simple cross barely visible in the night. "Look," Jamie's excited whisper carried from the back of the wagon. "We can see it." Nakai nodded, a rare smile crossing his face. "The path is clear from here," he said. "No more rocks." Eleanor felt hope surge in her chest, made stronger by the bonds forged in crisis. Their makeshift family had faced this challenge together, each contributing what they could. Matthew's strength, Nakai's guidance, Jamie's determination, her own resilience, all of it had proved necessary. The mission's steeple grew slowly larger as they pressed onward, their goal finally in sight. The patched axle continued to hold, carrying them forward on wings of desperate hope and shared determination. The mission's wooden steps creaked under their feet as Eleanor and Matthew climbed toward the entrance, Jamie and Nakai close behind. Eleanor's heart pounded. They had made it with precious minutes remaining before midnight, but would Preacher Amos agree to perform the ceremony? Matthew knocked firmly on the heavy door. Light spilled through the windows, a warm glow against the dark night. Footsteps approached from within, and the door swung open to reveal Preacher Amos Quinn, his silver hair disheveled as if he'd been reading late into the night. "Well now," the preacher said, taking in their road-worn appearance. "What brings such an unusual party to my door at this hour?" Eleanor stepped forward. "Preacher Quinn, we need your help. I must be married before midnight, or I'll lose my ranch to the railroad companies." The preacher's weathered face grew serious. He gestured them inside, where oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the mission's simple walls. "That's quite a declaration, Mrs. Voss. Please, explain further." As they gathered in the modest chapel, Eleanor quickly outlined their situation: the trust clause, the railroad schemes, the desperate race against time. Preacher Amos listened intently, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And you, Mr. Holt?" The preacher turned to Matthew. "What brings you to offer marriage under such circumstances?" Matthew stood straight, his quiet dignity filling the small space. "What's right is right, preacher. The railroad means to take not just land, but water rights that affect the whole territory." Preacher Amos paced before the altar, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Marriage isn't something to be rushed into, even with noble intentions. These water rights you speak of, they're more complicated than simple property, aren't they?" Nakai stepped forward then, his young face solemn in the lamplight. "The springs on Mrs. Voss's land, they are sacred to my people. Our ancestors rest there." The preacher's eyes widened slightly. "Ah, now we come to it." He turned back to Eleanor and Matthew. "Do you understand what you're involving yourselves in? A marriage touching on water rights and native burial grounds. That could spark serious conflict in these parts." Eleanor felt despair creeping in. The clock on the wall showed barely 15 minutes until midnight. But the preacher's words struck true. This wasn't just about her anymore. "Preacher," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I know how this looks. A desperate widow rushing to marry to save her property." She swallowed hard, then continued. "But this isn't about greed, or even just my family's legacy. My father, he knew about those burial grounds. He promised to protect them, and that promise passed to me through my first marriage. I aim to honor it." Matthew moved to stand beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. "We're not here to claim ownership, preacher. We stand as stewards, not owners. This marriage would protect both the land and those who've long held it sacred." Jamie spoke up from where he stood near Nakai. "Please, Preacher Quinn, the railroad men, they don't care about what's right. They just want to take everything." Preacher Amos studied them all for a long moment. His eyes lingered on how Jamie and Nakai stood together, on the way Matthew's quiet strength complemented Eleanor's fierce determination. The clock ticked steadily in the background, each second precious. "I've known you both separately for years," the preacher said finally. "Eleanor, your late husband's death left deep wounds, yet you've shown remarkable grace in caring for Jamie. And Matthew, you left the cavalry rather than participate in actions you felt wrong against the native peoples." He walked to the altar and picked up his Bible. "A marriage should be built on truth, not desperation. But I see truth here tonight, truth in how you've already begun acting as a family." He gestured to Jamie and Nakai. "Truth in how you view yourselves as protectors of the land, not just its owners." Eleanor hardly dared breathe as the preacher opened his Bible. "Does this mean—" "Yes," Preacher Amos said, a gentle smile crossing his face. "We have just enough time to do this proper, though I reckon this is the first midnight wedding I've performed in all my years of ministry." Relief flooded through Eleanor as Matthew took her hand. His calloused fingers were warm against hers, strong but gentle, just like the man himself. They moved to stand before the altar as the preacher began arranging his materials. The clock showed 7 minutes until midnight as Preacher Amos cleared his throat and opened his Bible to the marriage service. Jamie and Nakai stood as witnesses, their young faces glowing with hope in the lamplight. Preacher Amos raised his Bible, the leather-bound book catching the warm glow of the oil lamps. The small mission chapel felt intimate and sacred, its wooden walls seeming to hold their breath as the midnight hour approached. Eleanor and Matthew stood before the altar, their shadows stretching long behind them on the plank floor. "Dearly beloved," Preacher Amos began, his voice rich with years of ministry, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as Matthew took them in his. His touch was gentle, but sure, his calloused palms warm against her skin. She looked up into his face, finding strength in the quiet certainty she saw there. The lamplight caught the silver threads in his dark hair, and for the first time, she truly studied the kind lines around his eyes. Jamie and Nakai stood close together near the altar steps, their young faces solemn in the golden light. Jamie clutched his hat in his hands, while Nakai stood tall and dignified, understanding the gravity of the moment. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward midnight, but its sound seemed distant now, less threatening than before. "Marriage," Preacher Amos continued, "is not to be entered into lightly or in haste. Yet sometimes the Lord works in ways we cannot predict, bringing souls together in unexpected moments of need and revelation." He looked meaningfully at the couple before him. "Matthew Holt, will you take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife? Will you love her, comfort her, honor and keep her in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, keep yourself only unto her, so long as you both shall live?" Matthew's deep voice filled the chapel, steady and clear. "I will." "Eleanor Voss, will you take this man to be your lawful wedded husband? Will you love him, comfort him, honor and keep him, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, keep yourself only unto him, so long as you both shall live?" Eleanor's voice wavered slightly, but grew stronger with each word. "I will." "The rings, if you have them," Preacher Amos prompted gently. Matthew reached into his vest pocket and withdrew 2 simple gold bands. Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected him to have rings ready. He must have grabbed them from his shop before they left town, thinking ahead even in their rush. "These rings," the preacher said, "are a symbol of the unbroken circle of love. Gold of the earth, purified by fire, shaped by careful hands into something precious and lasting." He blessed the rings with a brief prayer, then nodded to Matthew. Matthew took Eleanor's left hand, his touch reverent. The ring slid perfectly onto her finger as he spoke the ancient words, "With this ring, I thee wed." Eleanor took the second ring, noting how it warmed to her touch. Matthew's large hand dwarfed hers as she placed the ring on his finger. "With this ring, I thee wed." The words felt right in her mouth, true despite the circumstances that had brought them here. The clock struck its first chime of midnight as Preacher Amos raised his hands. "By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." He smiled warmly. "You may kiss your bride." Matthew leaned down slowly, giving Eleanor time to meet him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, respectful, but carried a promise of deeper understanding to come. Jamie let out a small whoop of joy, while Nakai smiled broadly, his usual reserve breaking for a moment of pure celebration. The final stroke of midnight faded away as Preacher Amos opened his record book. "Now, let's make this official." He dipped his pen in ink and began recording the details of the ceremony. Eleanor and Matthew signed their names with steady hands, followed by Jamie and Nakai as witnesses. The preacher's signature completed the document, making their union legal and binding. A profound sense of peace settled over Eleanor as she watched the ink dry. The desperate race against time was over. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Not just her and Matthew, but Jamie and Nakai too, this unlikely family forged in a night of crisis and choice. Matthew's hand found hers again, and she squeezed it gratefully. In his eyes, she saw not a marriage of mere convenience, but the potential for something deeper, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The relief of securing her ranch mingled with a cautious hope for the future, warming her heart like the gentle lamplight that surrounded them. Preacher Amos closed his book with a satisfying thump. "May the Lord bless you and keep you," he intoned, "and give you peace." The words settled over them like a benediction, filling the small chapel with their ancient power. Jamie moved closer to Eleanor, his small hand slipping into hers on her free side. Nakai stood tall beside Matthew, completing their circle. For a precious moment, they stood together in the mission's lamplight, bound not by desperation but by choice. A family created in the space between one day and the next, as the midnight hour marked not an ending, but a beginning. The mission's wooden steps creaked under their feet as Eleanor, Matthew, Jamie, and Nakai emerged into the cool night air. Stars sparkled overhead, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of sage across the plains. Eleanor's new wedding ring caught the moonlight as she adjusted her shawl, still feeling the warmth of the ceremony in her heart. Matthew was securing their belongings in the wagon when the sound of thundering hooves split the quiet. A telegraph rider appeared from the darkness, his horse's flanks lathered with sweat. The young man nearly tumbled from his saddle, waving a yellow paper frantically. "Mrs. Voss, Mrs. Holt!" he called out, catching his breath. "Urgent telegram from Willow Creek." Eleanor's stomach tightened as she took the paper. Matthew moved closer, his solid presence steadying her as she unfolded the message. Jamie and Nakai drew near, their faces anxious in the moonlight. Her hands began to shake as she read the words aloud. "Marriage contestation filed. Stop railroad legal team claims. Invalid due mixed household. Stop foreclosure proceedings reinstated. Stop bank requires immediate response. Stop." The paper slipped from Eleanor's fingers. Matthew caught it before it could blow away, his jaw tightening as he reread the message. The victory they'd fought so hard to achieve seemed to crumble like dust. "Mixed household?" Jamie asked, confusion clear in his young voice. Nakai's face darkened with understanding. "They mean me," he said quietly, "because I live with you." Eleanor's throat constricted with anger and grief. "Those railroad vultures, they're using Nakai's presence to invalidate everything we've done tonight." Her voice cracked. "All this was for nothing." "No." Matthew's voice cut through her despair, firm and certain. "This changes nothing about what's true. We're legally married, witnessed and recorded. They're grasping at straws, trying to intimidate us with legal threats." The telegraph rider shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "There's talk in town," he added hesitantly. "Railroad lawyers arrived on the evening train. They're claiming the presence of a Native American minor in a white household violates territorial regulations." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. "Regulations?" "Nakaya's family. He's Jamie's brother in all but blood. How dare they? They dare because they think we'll give up." Matthew interrupted gently. He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "But there's still a path forward. We just need to think clearly." Nakai stepped forward, his young face set with determination. "I can leave," he offered quietly. "If that would save the ranch—" "No!" The word burst simultaneously from Eleanor, Matthew, and Jamie. "You're not going anywhere," Eleanor declared fiercely. She reached for Nakai's hand, gripping it tightly. "We didn't race across half the territory tonight, just to let them tear our family apart now." Matthew nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The railroad's using an old territorial statute that was never properly ratified. I remember it from my cavalry days. It was one of the reasons I left the service. We can fight this." "But how?" Eleanor asked, desperate hope creeping into her voice. "Judge Clayton," Matthew said firmly. "He's known for ruling on principle, not politics, and he's no friend to the railroad after they tried to seize his brother's farm last spring." The telegraph rider cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, but Judge Clayton's circuit takes him through Miller's station tomorrow morning. He'll be there till noon." Eleanor straightened her spine, new determination flowing through her. "Then that's where we'll be. How far to Miller's station?" 3 hours hard riding," Matthew calculated, studying the stars. "If we leave now and push through the night, we can make it by sunrise." Eleanor finished. She turned to the rider. "Thank you for bringing the message. Please tell the bank we'll have our response by noon tomorrow." The young man nodded, wheeled his horse around, and galloped back into the darkness. Eleanor watched him go, then faced her family. Her true family, bound by choice and love rather than mere blood or law. Jamie's face was set with determination that matched his aunt's. "We're not letting them win," he declared. "No, we're not." Matthew agreed, already moving to check the wagon's repaired axle. "But we'll need to travel light and fast. The wagon's too slow for this journey." Nakai's eyes lit up. "The mission has horses in their stable. Preacher Amos would let us borrow them." "4 horses." Eleanor nodded. "We'll ride through the night if we have to." She touched her new wedding ring like a talisman. "The railroad thinks they can use our family against us. They'll learn what real family means." Matthew disappeared into the mission to speak with Preacher Amos, while Jamie and Nakai ran to help prepare the horses. Eleanor stood alone for a moment under the vast starry sky, her heart heavy, but her spirit unbroken. The railroad's challenge had struck deep, but they had underestimated the strength of the bonds forged this night. When Matthew returned with Preacher Amos's blessing and the loan of 4 horses, Eleanor saw in his eyes the same unwavering determination she felt in her own heart. The railroad had made a grave mistake. They thought they could use Nakai's presence to destroy this family. Instead, they had given them one more reason to stand together and fight. The mission's study glowed warm with lantern light as Eleanor, Matthew, and Nakai gathered around Preacher Amos's weathered desk. Dust motes danced in the golden light as the preacher pulled leather-bound record books from sagging wooden shelves. "Your father was a frequent visitor here," Preacher Amos said, his fingers tracing down a page of spidery handwriting. "He spent many hours with the tribal elders, especially in his final years." Nakai leaned forward, his eyes bright with recognition. "My grandfather spoke of him. They would meet at the spring to pray together." He turned to Eleanor. "The elders said your father understood the sacred nature of the waters." Eleanor's hands trembled as she touched the faded pages. "Papa never told me about those meetings. He was so private about his dealings with the Apache people." Matthew stood behind her, studying the records over her shoulder. Perhaps he had reason to keep quiet. Those were difficult times between settlers and tribes. Preacher Amos nodded, pulling another volume from the shelf. "Indeed, your father was different, Eleanor. He saw beyond the prejudices of his time." As the preacher opened the book, a folded document slipped from between its pages. The paper was yellow with age, but still crisp, sealed with wax and legal ribbons. "What's this?" Eleanor whispered, carefully unfolding it. Matthew adjusted the lantern closer as they all bent to read. The legal language was dense, but the meaning became clear as they studied it. "It's a deed addendum," Matthew said, his voice filled with quiet amazement. "Your father arranged joint stewardship of the spring between his descendants and the Apache elders?" Eleanor's eyes widened. "To prevent anyone from exploiting the land? Or desecrating the burial grounds?" Nakai added softly. Preacher Amos adjusted his spectacles, examining the document. "This is properly notarized and filed. It's a binding legal agreement that supersedes standard property law. The railroad can't touch it." "Papa knew," Eleanor breathed. "He knew someday someone would try to take the spring, so he protected it, protected all of us, with this document." Matthew's hand found her shoulder, squeezing gently. "This changes everything. The railroad's contestation won't stand against this deed." The eastern sky blushed pink as their wagon rolled toward Willow Creek. Dawn light caught the dust rising from their wheels, turning it to floating gold. Eleanor sat beside Matthew on the driver's bench, their shoulders nearly touching. Jamie and Nakai dozed in the wagon bed behind them, wrapped in blankets against the morning chill. The precious deed lay secure in Eleanor's coat pocket, its weight a comfort against her heart. She glanced at Matthew's profile, noting how the rising sun highlighted the silver at his temples. His hands were steady on the reins, just as they'd been steady through every challenge of their desperate journey. "I reckon this isn't how you pictured marriage would come to you," Eleanor said softly, mindful of the sleeping boys. Matthew's mouth curved slightly. "No, Ma'am, it wasn't. But sometimes the best paths are the ones we don't expect." "When Thomas died," Eleanor continued, her voice catching, "I thought I'd never trust another man with my land or my heart." She smoothed her skirts. "But you've shown me what a true partnership can be." "Found family is the strongest kind," Matthew replied, his deep voice gentle. "We choose it with open eyes and willing hearts." Eleanor nodded, watching the familiar windmill appear on the horizon. "Even if this deed fails us somehow, I'm glad we're facing whatever comes together." "That's what marriage ought to be," Matthew said, "standing together when the fight seems lost." He glanced at the sleeping boys. "All four of us." The sun climbed higher as Willow Creek's buildings took shape before them. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the telegraph office's door stood open, ready for business. Eleanor straightened her spine, feeling Matthew's solid presence beside her. "They'll be waiting at the bank," she said. Matthew guided the horses around a bend in the road. "Let them wait. We have truth and law on our side now." Eleanor touched the deed in her pocket once more, drawing strength from its presence and from the quiet man beside her. They'd started this journey as desperate strangers. They were returning as something else entirely, a family forged in trust and common purpose. The wagon rolled to a stop before Willow Creek's bank just as the town clock struck 8. A crowd had already gathered, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. Bank Agent Phillips stood on the steps, his suit pressed and his smile sharp as a rattler's fang. 2 railroad men flanked him, their hands resting too casually near their gun belts. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but her grip remained steady on Matthew's arm as they descended from the wagon. Jamie and Nakai followed close behind, their young faces solemn in the morning light. "Well, well," Phillips drawled, his voice carrying across the hushed street. "If it isn't the widow Voss, returned from her midnight adventure." His eyes narrowed at Matthew. "Though I suppose that title no longer applies, does it?" Matthew's presence beside Eleanor was like an oak tree, tall, unwavering, rooted in quiet strength. He guided her forward, and the crowd parted before them. "We have our marriage certificate," Eleanor announced, her voice clear and strong. She withdrew the document from her coat, the preacher's signature still fresh on the page. "Signed before midnight, witnessed and legal?" Phillips barely glanced at the paper. "Oh, but haven't you heard?" He produced the telegram with a flourish. "We've received word contesting the validity of your arrangement. Seems there are concerns about the mixed nature of your household." His gaze slid meaningfully toward Nakai. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from anger at the naked prejudice in Phillips's words. "That's mighty interesting." Matthew spoke for the first time, his deep voice carrying easily across the street. "Considering what we found in the mission's archives," Eleanor reached into her coat pocket, drawing out the weathered deed addendum. The morning sun caught the official seal, making it gleam like a gold coin. "This document, signed and witnessed 25 years ago, establishes joint stewardship of the spring between my family and the Apache elders." Phillips's smirk faltered. "What nonsense is this?" "My father," Eleanor continued, her voice strengthening, "had the wisdom to protect both the land and its sacred history. This addendum makes it illegal to transfer or sell the water rights without consent from both parties." She held the document high, letting everyone see its official markings. "It's been registered with the Territorial Office since 1848. The railroad men shifted uncomfortably as Phillips snatched the document. His face paled as he read, recognizing the territorial governor's seal and signature. This changes nothing," he stammered, but the authority had drained from his voice. "It changes everything," Matthew said quietly. Your contestation is based on prejudice against a legal arrangement that's existed for decades. No judge will uphold it." Townsfolk pressed closer, their expressions changing as understanding dawned. Old Sam Tucker, who'd known Eleanor's father, spoke up from the crowd. "John Voss was a fair man. Always said that spring belonged to the land itself, not any one person. And now we know he made sure of it." Eleanor added, standing straighter. "Matthew and I are legally married. The spring's protection is legally binding, and your railroad will have to find another way around." Phillips crumpled the telegram in his fist, his face mottled red. The railroad men behind him exchanged glances, then stepped back, recognizing a lost cause. "The bank's loan is still due." Phillips tried one last time, but his voice was weak. "And it will be paid," Matthew replied, "from honest work on honest land, not through theft dressed up as law." More voices rose from the crowd, supporting Matthew's words. Eleanor saw Sarah from the general store nod firmly, and Reverend Wade step forward with a stern look at Phillips. Even the sheriff, usually careful to stay neutral in railroad matters, tipped his hat in Eleanor's direction. Phillips looked around at the sea of disapproving faces and seemed to shrink inside his fine suit. Without another word, he turned and hurried down the street, the railroad men trailing in his wake like scolded dogs. Eleanor's hands trembled as she tucked the precious documents away. Matthew's warm hand found her shoulder, steadying her. Jamie pressed against her side, and Nakai stood tall nearby, a proud smile touching his young face. "You did it, Aunt Eleanor," Jamie whispered. "We did it," she corrected, looking up at Matthew. "Together." The crowd began to disperse, many stopping to offer congratulations or shake Matthew's hand. Eleanor felt the morning sun warm on her face, watching her neighbors, her community, smile and nod as they passed. They'd won more than just the legal right to their land. They'd shown that justice could prevail without violence, that dignity could overcome greed. The bank's clock chimed the quarter hour, its familiar tone ringing out over Willow Creek's main street. But to Eleanor's ears, it no longer sounded like a countdown to loss. Instead, it marked the beginning of something new, a future built on trust, respect, and the strength of a family chosen by heart. The evening settled softly over the ranch house, bringing with it a peace Eleanor hadn't felt in years. Her hands moved with practiced ease as she struck the match, touching it to the kitchen lamp's wick. Golden light bloomed across the worn wooden table, catching the smile lines around her eyes. Matthew's boots made familiar creaks on the floorboards as he entered from the back porch. His tall frame filled the doorway for a moment before he stepped inside, carrying an armload of kindling. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and Eleanor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the lamp's glow. "Supper's almost ready," Jamie called from where he and Nakai worked together at the counter. The boys had insisted on helping, with Nakai teaching Jamie how to make traditional flatbread, while Jamie showed him his mother's method for seasoning beans. "Much obliged, boys," Matthew said, setting the wood beside the stove. He moved to stand near Eleanor, his presence solid and reassuring. Without the pressure of their rushed marriage or the railroad's threats, they could finally breathe easily in each other's company. The kitchen filled with the sounds of home. Spoons clinking against bowls, the crackle of the stove fire, and the boys' quiet laughter as they worked. Through the open window came the gentle music of the spring, its waters flowing freely over sacred ground, protected now by both law and love. "Smells mighty fine," Eleanor said, watching as Nakai showed Jamie how to flip the flatbread without breaking it. The Apache boy's eyes shone with pride as he taught his newfound brother, his movements sure and patient. Matthew's hand found Eleanor's shoulder, gentle but strong. "You've made a real home here," he said softly, meant for her ears alone. "Not just a house or a ranch, but a home." Eleanor leaned slightly into his touch, allowing herself to accept both the comfort and the truth of his words. "We've made it together," she corrected, watching as Jamie successfully flipped his flatbread, earning a proud nod from Nakai. Outside, the spring's waters caught the last light of day, glinting like silver through the kitchen window. The same waters that had sparked such conflict now sang peace to their little family, gathered safe in the lamplight's warm embrace. The boys brought the food to the table, and they all sat down together. Not as widow and blacksmith, not as orphans or outsiders, but as family. Eleanor looked around at their faces in the gentle lamp glow, Matthew's quiet strength, Jamie's bright eyes, Nakai's serene smile. Their bond, forged in desperate hours and tested by prejudice, had emerged stronger than any legal document could measure. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.